group of close friends decides to celebrate Zach's birthday by taking a trip to Mexico City on Dan's new yacht. Amy wears a life jacket because she has a deep fear of water. This fear started when she lost her father in a drowning accident while sailing. Her husband James encourages her to overcome her fear, and she finally steps onto the yacht. As the group explores the boat, they find Dan inside the cabin with his new girlfriend Michelle. They begin their trip, enjoying the ride, when Zach and Lauren curiously ask Dan how he could afford such an expensive yacht. Dan laughs and avoids answering. Later, James and Amy tuck their young daughter Sarah into bed in the cabin and leave a walkie-talkie next to her so they can hear if she wakes up. Michelle suggests that everyone go swimming in the warm water. The group excitedly agrees, except for Amy, who chooses to stay on the yacht with Dan. While checking on Sarah in the cabin, Dan opens up to Amy, admitting that he regrets many of his past mistakes and wishes he had a family like hers. Amy, who is happily married, cuts the conversation short and suggests they return to the deck. Meanwhile, the others are enjoying their swim. Michelle flirts with James, while Amy and Dan walk on the deck. Amy shares her fear that her hydrophobia might be passed on to her daughter. In an impulsive move, Dan grabs Amy and jumps into the water with her, ignoring her terrified screams. Amy panics as she recalls the traumatic memory of her father's drowning. Suddenly, they realize Dan forgot to lower the ladder before jumping into the water, leaving them stranded in the sea with no way to get back on the yacht. James tries to calm Amy while the others desperately attempt to climb back onto the yacht, but the sides of the boat are too high. They notice a flag hanging on the stern, and Dan tries to use it to pull himself up, but the fabric tears under his weight. Once Amy starts to regain her composure, the group works together to find a solution. Amy reminds everyone that they must act quickly because Sarah is alone on the yacht. Exhausted and scared, Michelle loses control and starts to drown. In desperation, she tries to grab Amy's life jacket, but the others push her away to save Amy. Lauren, trying to comfort Michelle, carries her on her back and recites a prayer to calm her down. The group remains stuck in the water under the hot sun, growing increasingly tired and thirsty. Suddenly, they hear a phone ringing from Zach's jacket, which is hanging on the boat. Dan throws the jacket down, and Zach manages to grab the phone, but it is too wet to work. In a panic, Michelle snatches the phone from Zach, but it slips from her hands and falls into the water, destroying their only chance to call for help. Dan then suggests that they take off their clothes, tie them together, and use the makeshift rope to pull themselves up. As they prepare to do this, they notice a boat passing by at high speed. They desperately try to signal for help, but the passengers misunderstand and wave back as they sail away. With no other options, the group returns to Dan's plan. Using a knife found in Zach's jacket, they cut their clothes into strips and tie them together to form a long rope. James wonders if there is any way to climb up from underneath the boat. Dan is unsure, so James decides to dive underwater and check. Meanwhile, Zach tries to climb up using the homemade rope, but it snaps, causing him to fall back into the water. James also fails in his attempt and loses the knife in the process. While resurfacing, he hits his head on the bottom of the boat. Lauren notices blood coming from James's ear, a sign that he has been seriously hurt. Frustrated, Zach grabs the knife and starts stabbing holes into the side of the boat, hoping to create a foothold. Dan tries to stop him, fearing damage to the yacht, and in the struggle, Dan accidentally stabs Zach in the stomach. Through the walkie-talkie, they hear Sarah crying inside the boat, scared and alone. Zach, badly wounded and without medical help, slowly dies in Lauren's arms. Michelle drifts away from the group and eventually drowns due to exhaustion. Dan tries to save her, but realizes it's too late. James, overwhelmed by the situation, lashes out at Dan, accusing him of caring more about the boat than his friends' lives. Dan finally admits that he doesn't actually own the yacht. He had borrowed it from his boss and pretended to be the owner to impress his friends and attract women like Michelle. He wanted everyone to believe he was successful, even though he wasn't. Lauren admits that she was in love with Zach, but never told him. Amy comforts her and convinces her to let go of Zach's body. As time passes, the group remains stranded, and James's condition worsens and starts speaking incoherently. Lauren, unable to bear the inactivity, says goodbye to her friends and swims away, hoping to reach shore and call for help. On the yacht, Sarah continues to cry. Amy tries to comfort her through the walkie-talkie, but it doesn't work. She then remembers Zach's idea about using a knife to climb up. Determined to save Sarah, she decides to dive underwater to search for the lost knife. Dan stops her, feeling responsible, and insists on going instead. As night falls, Amy is left alone in the water with James, who is slipping in and out of consciousness. He tells Amy that he is tired and has a headache. Rain starts to fall, and James quietly dies in the water. Heartbroken, Amy cries out in agony over the loss of her husband. Dan hears her cries but continues to dive underwater, determined to find the knife and save them. Amy finally accepts James's death and releases his body into the water. She sings the lullaby they used to sing to Sarah as a final goodbye. Suddenly, Dan surfaces, screaming in pain due to a muscle cramp. Amy removes her life jacket and shares it with Dan to help him swim. However, a storm begins, making survival even harder. Dan smashes his goggles against the yacht's stern and breaks them. He plans to use the glass as a foothold. He wedges the glass between the board and the folding gangway and uses it to support himself. He calls out to Amy, who uses Dan's hand as a step to try to climb onto the boat. Her hand slips in the rain, and she falls back into the water. Dan encourages her to try again. Amy steps on his shoulders and makes another attempt, but Dan struggles to hold onto the sharp glass, screaming in pain as she steps on his arm. Amy slips again, but gathers her strength for one final attempt. This time, she manages to grab onto the side of the boat and pull herself onto the deck. Overwhelmed with relief, Dan laughs and shouts for joy. Amy lowers the gangway and rushes to the cabin to comfort her crying daughter. Dan clings to the gangway, but hesitates. He must decide whether to save himself or take responsibility for everything that happened. Amy, holding Sarah, feels relieved that the nightmare is finally over. However, she notices that Dan never climbed aboard. Looking over the edge, she sees his life jacket floating alone in the water. She then spots Dan's still body drifting away. She calls out to him, but he doesn't respond. He has chosen to let himself drown, overwhelmed by guilt. Suddenly, Amy remembers watching her father drown when she was a child. Determined to prevent another tragedy, she overcomes her fear of water and swims after Dan. As she tries to save him, memories of her father's death flood her mind. The next morning, Sarah wakes up in the cabin and begins to cry. The story ends with Amy standing on the deck, looking out at the horizon. Dan lies unconscious at her feet, having been saved by her bravery, and can now return home.